Hello everyone, this is the second installment in the Muscular System Notes. So we did a lot of stuff in class, so this one is also going to be reasonably short. This is focusing on what happens with ATP. So if you remember when we talked about muscle contraction, ATP major role was to unhook the myosin head from the actin fiber, thus releasing the head of the myosin from the actin fiber and relaxing the muscle so the muscle could stretch back to its original place. And it was quite strange in a way that ATP, which we normally think of as being the energy source and making things happen, actually unhooked the head and made the muscle relax. It's still adding energy and making things happen. The energy, the chemical energy that's stored in ATP, like I said before in class, is being converted to kinetic energy. So when it unlocks the myosin head, it's actually adding some kinetic energy to that myosin head for a later contraction. So it's partially true that it does, relax the muscle, but it also primes it to contract again. So if you remember, maybe you don't, maybe you didn't go over this, I don't know. Usually we do this in AP biology. Depends on what kind of biology class you had, if you were in honors or CP, and how far you went. Sometimes you get into the aerobic respiration diagram that you see here, and sometimes you don't. I personally think it's not that interesting. Not really too interested in the chemistry of a lot of the reactions in too much detail. And I find a lot of my students, some of them are really interested, but some are not. So and I also find a lot of my students haven't even talked about this. So rather than starting from scratch, I kind of don't get into what happens in the mitochondria. You do see on the bottom here that there are some ATP being made, and they always show this little like sparkly energy type of thing. So the key point here, there's two big pathways. One pathway inside the mitochondria, where 36 total ATPs are being made. So they're showing that here. You have the citric acid cycle and phosphorylation. And then we have the glycolysis cycle, where only 2 ATP being made, which you can see is, they're trying to show you that it's outside the mitochondria, but oops, it's just a different pathway for making ATP. So actually one makes a lot, one makes very little. You got 36 versus 2. So obviously one is better than the other. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I'm not going to get into this too much. When you go read your book on this section, it really gets into this detail. So I've kind of give you this simple overview, and you're welcome. So we've been talking about ATP and ADP a lot, so chemically here's what it looks like. Really the thing that we're interested in is the phosphate groups. Phosphate is always a phosphorus surrounded by 4 oxygens. So you can see you got one here, and one here, so that's normal ATP molecule. And the high energy bonds, high energy chemical bonds, are between the phosphorus and the oxygen. And here's where one of those phosphates is broken off. It's now ADP. It's only got 2 phosphates on it. That's kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. The mitochondrial process that I showed you earlier, right here, and also a little bit right there, takes that phosphorus, puts it back on. So here we have the basically 100% stored battery. This one is depleted by 1/3, and is primarily unusable by most portions of the cell, if not all of them, to be honest with you. So here's some good information. So obviously ATP is involved, along with calcium, making the muscle contraction. Calcium is generally readily available because your bones hold a lot of it. Your body makes sure that there's a lot in the blood, which makes sure that there's a lot in other blood tissues. So calcium is usually not the thing that is going to not make a muscle contract. It's usually going to be the ATP is not going to allow the muscle to become relaxed because it has run out. So here's the 3 ways that ATP is provided to you by muscles, or provided by the muscles themselves to themselves. So you only have 4 to 6 seconds worth of stored ATP in your muscles. You know, that's going to vary from person to person. Take that with a little grain of salt. You got less than 10 seconds worth, which is fine when you're just making everyday little tiny movements with your fingers when you're writing or something like that. And then your body will quickly make more ATP. Not a big deal. This is just for normal movements. Even walking, I mean, you still have that little rest time when your muscles are relaxing. If you're walking for any length of time, though, you're going to need to have more ATP. So we have some ways of doing that. We have a molecule called creatine phosphate, which is stored in muscles, quickly adds a phosphate to any free-floating ADP to turn it into ATP. That phosphate gets bumped off the creatine molecule, gets put into ATP. ATP can be used right away. And generally you get like a 20-second supply. So if you're doing some basic movements around the house, a little light exercise, you're getting into using creatine phosphate and some stored ATP. It's not really exerting too much. But really, when you start to exercise, you get into it for a while, you start to activate the pathway called aerobic respiration. And aerobic, just like when someone does aerobics, requires oxygen or heavy breathing. So this requires a lot of oxygen and glucose. And like I said before, this makes 36 ATP. And it makes it for every one glucose molecule. So it's making a lot of energy from one little glucose sugar molecule. Glucose is floating around in your blood. This is what we make, or at least what we take from carbohydrates. It is a carbohydrate. It's the simplest carbohydrate. So your body breaks down all carbohydrates into the components, which is glucose. So aerobic respiration will last as long as glucose and oxygen are available. But generally, at some point, and this depends totally on the person, one of those two things, glucose and oxygen, is going to start to become lesser in value. And at some point, the aerobic respiration reaction is not going to continue. Generally, it's going to be the oxygen levels are going to get too low. Most of us have a pretty good store of glucose. And we're able to dump a lot of it from our stored glucose stores in our liver. And eventually, too, we break it down from glycogen that's stored in our liver and from our muscles. So it's usually our bodies become overwhelmed with not getting enough oxygen in the body. Carbon dioxide levels build up too much. We become out of breath. That's usually how that happens. But if you were running a marathon, doing very extended exertion, and it's possible that you could be in such good shape that you are able to get enough oxygen in your body, but you might be able to run out of glucose. Your body might not be able to make more. All right, so I'm really thinking marathon runners for that. So what happens is your body switches to anaerobic glycolysis, which anaerobic means without oxygen. So this is used when glucose or oxygen or one of them is low, or both of them are low. So it does not require that oxygen. It does require some glucose. So this is why I said earlier, usually it's the oxygen that runs out first. If you're not able to undergo anaerobic glycolysis, you won't have any ATP, so you just collapse. So this makes only 2 ATP for every 1 glucose. So it's very inefficient. It makes a byproduct called lactic acid that promotes fatigue and soreness. So this stimulates receptors in the muscles, inflammatory receptors in the muscles and other parts of the body, because these will get into the blood and float around everywhere. And they'll basically give a feedback signal to the brain that you're undergoing anaerobic glycolysis in many of your muscles, and your brain's going to start getting that signal to stop. And you start feeling some pain. So it's your body telling you to knock it off. And if you don't, you'll collapse. Eventually what starts to happen though, before you collapse, is you start getting muscle cramps, start hurting real bad. So usually those things will stop people before they get to that point where they actually collapse. So you will be in a state of muscle fatigue when you are in the process of using anaerobic glycolysis. They're tired. You get a low supply of ATP. The acidity of the muscles start to increase due to lactic acid buildup. And these factors will start to hinder muscle contraction. And when you start to get cramps from that lack of ATP, like we talked about in class, that is a version of rigor mortis. So your muscles are temporarily not able to uncontract themselves. And when you do get a muscle cramp, it is like full 100% contraction. And it hurts. It doesn't feel good. And there's nothing you can do about it. I got a muscle contraction one time in my calf muscles. I did a gym workout the day before. One where I kind of tore up the muscles pretty good. And then I went and hiked up Mount Monadnock up in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, which is a pretty good hike. It's about, 2 hours, 3 hours each way, depending which trail you take. And on the way down, which is basically above the tree line, was basically steep rocks. One of my calves cramped up going down, and I basically took a 30-foot tumble down this rocky trail, and got scraped up pretty good. And if that was in a worse spot, I could have gone over the edge. So that can be pretty serious. So the muscle contractions will stop due to low ATP. Ouch, I just got a muscle contraction in my arm doing that. What the heck? How ironic. That was from the gym also. Anyways, so try to avoid muscle fatigue, obviously people try to build up endurance. So this is increased through aerobic exercise. All right. So when you exercise, there's a lot of good things that happen. One of the big things that happens to the muscles is that they increase their blood supply. So they will grow new blood vessels. Blood vessels will be more likely to be dilated. So you get more blood going to the muscles, and that will also, your muscles will also make more mitochondria in each muscle fiber. When someone gets in shape, part of this is that their mitochondria are making more ATP so they can last longer. Other side benefits happen outside of the muscular system, like you increase your lung capacity, your cardiovascular system becomes more efficient, your heart gets stronger so it can pump more blood using less energy. All of these things will add together to more endurance. So when someone's in shape, there are physiological processes that are happening inside the person's body that, is allowing them to work longer than they had before. So when somebody plays sports, it's important that you don't have an off season, that you keep exercising 12 months a year, even if you're not playing the sport for a couple months, just to keep your body in shape, keep that endurance up. So when you get back to playing sports again, you're at tip-top shape earlier than everybody else who wasn't exercising. So a concept that comes up a lot when we talk about fatigue and endurance and things like that is what we call the oxygen debt. And you can see this when somebody's exercising, and then you stop exercising, not moving anymore, you go and sit down, and you're still breathing very heavily. So the faster that your breath rate, or respiration rate, whatever you want to call it, respiration rate goes back to the normal resting respiration rate, faster that happens, the more in shape you are, because you're able to pay back your oxygen debt that much quicker. So the lactic acid buildup is reversible. You can remove that lactic acid, the more oxygen you get into your body. You can rebuild all the ATP and creatine phosphate supplies. And once all that is done, only then will the oxygen levels go back up. Carbon dioxide levels will go down. So those two factors are going to determine your respiration rate. So the better shape you're in, the more likely and more faster that your body is going to pay back your oxygen debt, the more likely your breathing rate is going to go back to where it was at rest. So that is why you keep breathing heavily even after you stop exercising, because you got to fix what is broken inside your muscles, so to speak. So that creatine phosphate stuff that I was talking about, it's a very safe bodybuilding supplement. I mean, obviously you don't want to take too much of anything, but if you are exercising regularly and playing a sport, you can read the instruction on the bottle, and they usually take, they usually have one little scooper things in them. So they'll say, take 2 of these a day, or take 4 of these a day if you're exercising all the time. But even using it every once in a while, it does work pretty good because, right here you're adding creatine phosphate, and it's a natural product, it's a safe product, nothing else, they don't put anything in it. So it's something that your body's making anyways. So this gives you a little bit of extra push when you're at the gym, lifting weights, and it'll give you a little bit of extra push when you are playing basketball or running or whatnot, whatever you're doing. It's not going to be a panacea, it's not going to turn into the super athlete, but it does help give you a little bit of push, and it's relatively safe. So you can see that out there. It's not cheap though. It's relatively pricey. A regular, bottle, jar, or this, might run you like $30. And you can go through it relatively quickly if you're taking it 2 or 3 times a day. Other than that though, there's some protein, the whey proteins that you see, egg proteins you see out there, they're relatively safe. But again, you can overdo it if you take too much of that stuff. Because your kidneys do have to deal with high levels of protein that get too high. But those are pretty safe supplements. All the other stuff you got out there in GNC, it's all, I don't want to say completely questionable, but it's questionable whether you need it or not. Even with those protein powders too. You can eat chicken breast and milk. Just drink milk, eat chicken breast. So they give you the same stuff. Complete proteins. Eat some cheese. It's the same stuff. Eat peanuts, soybeans. I think it's just probably, making a shake is convenient, and they usually throw a lot of sugar and chocolate in it, so it's good. People can drink it as they're in the gym. Not necessarily needed, though. All right, last couple things. Since we're on the topic of exercising and muscles, you got two different kinds of exercises. You got aerobic exercises and resistance exercise. So aerobic exercise is generally high heart rates, low muscular impact, low weight impact. So you got running, walking, swimming, etc. So this is more focused on increasing flexibility. The stimulation in your joints and your muscles promotes any repair of your tissues, which is going to allow them to be more flexible because they're not damaged. And like I said before, it'll allow less fatigue for all those reasons I mentioned earlier. Whereas resistance exercise, this is more you are pushing up against a weight, pushing something against gravity. So this is low heart rate. Sometimes the heart rate goes up depending on what you're doing, obviously, but this is low heart rate. This is more focusing on what's going on inside those muscle fibers themselves. You're looking for lots of little micro tears inside your muscles. People that are looking to get their muscles just bigger, not necessarily more endurance, they'll do lower reps at the gym. They might do 5 to 6 repetitions per set instead of 10 to 15 if you're looking for more endurance. And they're looking for higher weights, and they're looking for their muscles to be sore when they leave the gym. They should hurt a little bit, but not enough where it's damaging. So they should hurt a little bit. If you're playing sports, you want a nice balance. You don't want your muscles to be too torn up where you easily get a muscle cramp, or too torn up where they're not going to perform optimally. So usually when people work out for playing sports, but they want to add some muscle or keep their muscle, they also want endurance, the rep ranges they're going to use is 10 to 12 per set. So that's usually a pretty good range, and don't do too much weight where you feel your muscles tearing too much. So there's, depending on your goal, depending what you want to do, depending how you should take care of what you do with yourself when preparing for sports. So there's a bunch of videos I'm going to show you on the end of this week. One on the Ultra Marathon Man, they're both Stanley Superhumans. And you have this crazy guy. Well, this guy's pretty crazy. Ultra Marathon Man, he's crazy too. This Dennis Rogers guy. What I like about this show is that they bring you to the laboratory. And so we'll watch these, and we'll see if we can figure out what's going on inside their muscles. What's special about these two people. All right, so there's a little bit of question to go along with this. So not too long, not too bad. And thanks for listening.